Okay, what's this talk all about? It's about the importance of the 1882 Cemeteries Act. And I just wanted to share with you why I think that's so important to just understanding why you may well have difficulties trying to find an ancestor back in the mid-late 19th century. It's because that act wasn't in force. In November 2004, Stephen Deed presented a Master of Arts thesis to the University of Otago entitled, wait for it, Unearthly Landscapes, the Development of the Cemetery in 19th Century New Zealand. Now that thesis noted the 19th century was a time, quote, a time of transition for British burial practices, with the traditional churchyard burial ground giving way to the modern cemetery. And for Britain, so for New Zealand. In his thesis, Deed defines at least 10 categories of cemeteries in 19th century New Zealand. Maori Urupa, pre-1950s Pākehā burial grounds, church mission station burial grounds, churchyards, urban or municipal cemeteries, rural or small town cemeteries, goldfield cemeteries, and these are mainly in Otago and on the west coast, cemeteries from the New Zealand Wars, family cemeteries on private land, and lone or individual graves which are often unmarked. Now there are other cemeteries as well, for example those on quarantine islands, but this is an attempt, if you like, to try and systematise the different types of cemeteries. Now the degree of details concerning those buried in those different types of cemeteries varies widely, and that's especially before 1882. And this is partly because the 19th century, those working as undertakers, which of course is a prime source materials in the 20th century, they like to be carpenters, cabinet makers. They provide the coffin, they actually build the coffin, and arrange transport for the body to the cemetery. And that's it. So not really great for record keeping. Now, New Zealand was actually relatively late in the field if you compare it with the UK in terms of burial record details. Legislation in England, that's all of England, 1853, Scotland in 1855. Those acts of Parliament include a requirement that public cemeteries have burial registers. And those burial registers are to allow for the location of burials, and they're to be indexed. And that's almost 30 years before New Zealand. So I've got a couple of case studies here to look through, and of course, no surprise to a number of people in the audience. The first one is Simon Street Cemetery. According to the New Zealand Observer of 4th of August 1938, the earliest headstone in Simon Street Cemetery was that of a boy aged 9 who was buried in 1841. From the St Paul's Anglican Church Register, we can identify him as 9-year-old William Mason, who died 11th of September 1841 and was buried 13th of September 1841, son of William and Sarah Mason. However, his wasn't the first grave dug in what became Simon Street Cemetery. We understand the first person buried there was a child from a soldier's family, and that was sometime between September 1840 and February 1841. The body was carried from the waterfront to the fern-covered slopes of Grafton Gully, which suggests it's an Anglican burial, but we don't know. But sometime later, the burial party couldn't locate the grave due to rapid growth of fern. So what I assume they want to do is put a wooden cross on it and they can't locate the grave. The first actual burial from St Paul's Anglican Church, which of course is now where Britomart used to be, male called Emerson, aged around 40, and he was buried 1st of February 1841. The second burial from St Paul's was a soldier from the 80th Regiment named Callagher. He was actually Roman Catholic, and he was buried by one of his persuasion sometime in 1841. So you have an Anglican church record, and it's noting the burial of a Catholic. Okay. This is young days for Auckland. There was no separate Catholic section until September 1852. So what does this tell us? We have some unidentified or partially unidentified lone graves in a remote part of the new town of Auckland, and of course that was founded by Governor Hobson in September 1840. However, it wasn't until 12th of July 1842 that Governor Hobson granted around 9 acres of land to the Anglican Church for a churchyard cemetery, and that land was consecrated within a fortnight. 1843, another acre added to the Anglican cemetery. In November 1843, a further acre set aside for the Jewish community. Other denominations were buried to the south of the Jewish cemetery in an unofficial general cemetery, and from 1852 on the east side of Simon Street to the north of the Anglican cemetery. Presbyterian cemetery not formalised till 1869, and the Wesleyan and the new general cemetery 1872. Thus, we have lone graves of the early 1840s being joined by other graves in what was to become denominationally based cemeteries. These are not churchyard cemeteries, but cemeteries associated with churches. In the case of the Catholic cemetery, those churches were St Patrick's and St Benedict's, and also St Francis de Sales Burial Chapel. The first traceable piece of legislation potentially affecting Simon Street and other cemeteries in Auckland Province is basically North Cape to Taupo, was the central government's 1871 Auckland Burial Ground Act, and that had the intent of closing the various burial grounds in Simon Street and, quote, acquiring suitable burying grounds as convenient as possible to the city. That replacement cemetery was to be administered by the Auckland Provincial Council rather than by the churches, so we have a new change here. Note the notion of the transfer of cemetery administration from something for which churches took responsibility to something that public bodies were to administer. However, disagreements as to site nullified the intent of this legislation, and Simon Street Cemetery was eventually closed for any new plots in 1886 by order in council after the good old 1882 Cemeteries Act. Now, my second case study is actually for Dunedin cemeteries. The Southern Dunedin Cemetery was formed in 1858 by the Otago Provincial Council. So you have public administration of that cemetery. Anderson's Bay, 1862. Both were, along with most other early Pākehā cemeteries, organised along denominational lines. Southern Cemetery, example, had Anglican, Catholic, Jewish, Chinese, and Presbyterian or general sections. On the other hand, the North Dunedin Cemetery was formed only under its own Act of Parliament in 1872, and from the outset was administered by the Dunedin City Council. The 1872 Enabling Act allowed the council to organise the cemetery along denominational lines, but instead the cemetery was organised non-denominationally in 3 classes, with a price differential between each. Class 1, of course, was the most expensive. Class 3, the least expensive, and where the council could bury paupers free of charge. Now, North Dunedin Cemetery has a full register of burials from 1872, but the denomination of the person buried isn't included in the register. Now, these registers are actually, well, I was going to turn around and see the Ancestry website, but it's actually part of they are actually on the NZSG tombstone transcriptions. The burial register, okay? So it's not tombstone transcriptions, it's a full register transcription. Third one is Bolton Street Cemetery. Now for Bolton Street, just the monumental inscriptions are on the NZSG. In 1874, central government enacted the Burial Ground Closing Act to enable provincial superintendents, this is a time where we still have provincial government, to close cemeteries in their province on public health grounds. And this was especially so the denominationally based Bolton Street Cemetery in Wellington. The Anglican section was opened in 1851, the Jewish in 1852, and the General in 1854. Also in 1874, the Auckland Provincial Council enacted their Private Burials Prevention and Regulation Act. Don't you know the names of those titles? That act restricted the burial of remains on private land, again as a public health measure. Further, Central Government's 1875 Plans of Towns Regulation Act also made illegal any cemetery reserves within town borders, and that would have affected any new churchyard cemeteries. The Wellington Provincial Council had already prohibited burials within the borders of the then Whanganui Township and surrounds from 1855. And all these acts confirm public health concerns with cemeteries in urban areas. For example, the cemeteries in Simon Street were close to wells, which had been sunk for drinking water on the north side of Karangahape Road. Note the 1874 Burial Ground Closing Act was also allowed for cremation, but this didn't become a real option until the 20th century. Across New Zealand, the dead were buried rather than being an option for cremation. The crematorium at Waikimete Cemetery was operating from August 1923, but it is until 1948 that cremations begin to outnumber burials in that major cemetery. The provinces were abolished in 1876, and Central Government's 1877 Cemeteries Management Act enabled government to make appointments to boards of trustees to administer cemeteries as required. Now, at that time, cemeteries were almost exclusively church-run. However, nothing in this legislation, despite the example from the UK back in the 1850s, nothing in this legislation included provision for registers of plots or similar. The Cemeteries Management Act of 1878 and the Cemeteries Bill of 1878, both of them were withdrawn, made no provision for registers either. Thus, to 1882, most cemeteries had no official rules as to compilation of registers, plot maps, or similar. And the authorities administering these cemeteries didn't see them as necessary. Churches did keep record of services for the departed, but many of those registers didn't survive, and I'm sure we've all got examples of that. And the Auckland City Council didn't have administration of Simon Street Cemetery to the end of 1909. Now, if you go hunting on the NZSG transcriptions for Simon Street, you'll end up with two lists. One is the earnest transcriptions that were done in the 1950s of the headstones, but of course it doesn't give any locations, and there are factual errors and so on and so forth with them. And the other list that's given for Simon Street Cemetery are the removed graves. These are the Anglican and Roman Catholic removed graves. Now, when they're removed, they're actually only temporarily removed, if I could be so bold. They are actually, the remains were disinterred, the remains were taken to Waikimete Cemetery for cremation, then they were returned as cremated remains, individually casketed, and they were buried under plots. So when it says removed graves, I think that's a slight misnomer, because they were only removed for the cremation and then returned. Okay. Now, the 1882 Cemeteries Act, which we're all here to listen to. The 1882 Act allowed for direct local government management of cemeteries without the need for an individual enabling act. Okay, Dunedin City Council needs an individual enabling act for the North Dunedin Cemetery. After 1882, they didn't require a special act of parliament. They had enough legislative ability to do that. After all, local authorities can only do what central government enables them to do. And Section 57 of the 1882 Act, for the first time, allowed for full registers of burials, a real boon for family historians. Thank you. I can read it out. Fine. All burials within any cemetery or burial ground shall be registered in a book or register to be provided and kept for that purpose by the trustees or managers of such a cemetery or burial ground respectively. And such register shall be distinguished in what parts of the cemetery or burial ground the several bodies are buried, and a proper description of every grave shall be given so that the situation thereof can be ascertained, i.e. where is it? And any such register shall be indexed to facilitate searches for entries therein. Every register should be open for inspection at reasonable hours in the daytime upon payment of fee of 1 shilling for every such inspection. That's not cheap. Okay, and those days, that's not cheap. Okay, so ardent family historians of the 19th century who would wanting to go and look at registers, they had to have quite a bit of money with them. Okay, the 1872 North Dunedin Cemetery Act, the legislation only specified a register of permissions for monuments or tombstones, not for a full register, just permissions for monuments or tombstones. But fortunately for researchers, from the outset, the good old Dunedin City Council compiled a register of all burials. The administrators of the general, that's non-Anglican, Catholic or Jewish, section of Bolton Street Cemetery in Wellington, created a register following the 1882 Act, and even tried to retrospectively include burials as far back as 1849. But as I noted before, they've only got tombstone transcriptions. The various administrators of Simon Street Cemetery, on the other hand, had a mixed response to documenting burials. The Wesleyan section was mapped around 1882 and the Anglican section 1887, but no formal register compiled, only a snapshot who was believed to be buried there at the time. Now, the 1882 Cemeteries Act, as well as giving permissions to local authorities and registers, also codified existing legislation regarding private burials. And this is where a lot of the early burials, why we can't find them, they were private burials. Section 83, it shall not be lawful to enter any body upon any land whatsoever, not being a cemetery or burial ground or burial vault, if there shall be any such cemetery or burial ground or burial vault within 5 miles of the place where the death should have taken place, or the place whence the body should be taken for the purpose of being interred. So that means that if there's a burial plot within 5 miles, which is about 12k or whatever, they have to bury them there. If you're living up the back blocks of Northland or Waikato, whatever, yes, private burials can still take place. But this is 1882. The train sets are starting to move around New Zealand. There are communities being set up, logging communities, farming, etc., etc. So New Zealand is beginning to popularise the country. And notice here, every person who shall offend against the provisions of this section shall be liable to a penalty not exceeding, just drop my glasses, £50. So therefore, if you wanted to go and bury your relative in the family plot on your farm, and there was a cemetery close at hand, henceforth you weren't allowed to do that at the exceeding price of £50, which is probably about a third of people's total annual income. Now, there were and there are some exceptions to this, because there was a dispensation able to be sought from a magistrate or justice of the peace or mayor or councillors, any of the above. And so I suspect that there was some variation in how this was applied in practice, but nevertheless the intent was to do away with private burials on private plots and undocumented. Thus, from 1882, people essentially had to be buried in a cemetery, unless they were in the rural back blocks of New Zealand, and that cemetery had to have a register. Now, not all passed that test. We know about death certificates, didn't and don't include place of burial, and even after 1876, the information may be wrong. Clerical, informant error, reburial, such and such. The place of burial could be a burial on private land without any other documentation, or only documented in church records, which may or may not have survived. Often those church records don't include the name of the cemetery, where they may be buried, and certainly don't give plot details. And that's particularly so if it isn't a churchyard burial. We are used to post-1882 situation, where local councils or trusts administer more recent cemeteries, and most have readily available plot maps and registers. Simon Street Cemetery database went online in 1999, and I'm really proud to be part of this process that makes sure that the NZSG transcriptions, which I'm sure we've all used at different times, is actually much more available. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Gay Williams from the NZSG, and together with Diane, we're going to tell you a little bit about the records that are not online, because as you can see here, it isn't all online, but we do have this amazing resource that Ben will talk about that now is online. So, the records that we have include cemetery books, microfiche, library books, CDs, funeral records, certificates collections, and various other miscellaneous things. So we're just going to talk about these very briefly, because I know really we want to look at the online stuff. The cemetery books are a series of books that most of you know what they look like, where the material has been typed up, and we have an index that enables you to have a look and see just which book should I look at, because it's quite a complicated little index. And it contains burial records and sometimes, if you're lucky, headstone transcriptions. And so you have a book that you can come in and sit down and look at, and it will say here, row L, 231, James Mackenzie, died 8th of July, 1920, age 64, and Anne Mackenzie, who died the 17th of February, 1936, aged 75. And so you've got that information that you can then go have a look at in the appropriate row. These books are obviously searchable personally if you come into the FRC, to the NZSG's library, or they can be researched through the New Zealand Society of Genealogists research services. Not enough people do this because there's huge resources. All you need is a little email or a little phone call and say, could you look at this or could you look at that? And yes, and sure we can. The cemetery book guide is arranged geographically, so when people come to look, they can say, okay, I know it was somewhere down in Palmerston North, so you go and look at the guide and it says Palmerston North, and it gives you the names of the cemeteries in Palmerston North and the dates of the records that are available. We also, of course, have the microfiche, and these mostly now are on ancestry.com.au. And so we smile very sweetly to Ben and say thank you very much, because that will then mean they're accessible to a whole lot more people. The microfiche, as most of you know, sit in a drawer like this and you fiddle around, get it out, and if you're very good, you put a little marker where you took it from so it goes back in the right place. And then you put your, you put your microfiche into the microfiche reader and can spend hours and hours going through. Fortunately, they're alphabetical, which is a real help. Then we, of course, have the library books, and the library books specific to particular families, to particular cemeteries, to regions, and that gives you a lot of social history as well as the information that you might be looking for. And you can look through the NZSG Library catalogue, and that's available to everybody. It isn't just for members, it's available to all, because one of our objects is to make education widely available to everybody. And this is the website of our, the link to our website. And again, you can use our research services. You go on and you look at the library catalogue, search the library, find the book, and then send in an email and say, could you look in this book and see if there's any reference to so-and-so? Because a lot of those books have been catalogued so that the content of the book is also available. Oops, is that what I'm doing? Yes, and now it's Diane. You're going to come and do the CDs, etc.
I want to talk to you first about the burial locator. This is a guide for you. It will tell you, if you put a name in, the cemetery where that person is buried. So you don't have to search through everywhere to look. it will give you that he's buried in Hillsborough. You can go straight to that record. It has records as well as the NZSG transcriptions. It has records from various councils, so you're getting a much wider range of people available. It also has records from death clippings and things like that. So it gives you a fuller, and it is actually later than the records that we currently have online. That's not to say we're not going to get more, but that's what we currently have online. The Kiwi Index is available only to members to purchase, and this has a lot more records also of cemeteries which have been transcribed after the fiche were prepared, so you're going to get a lot more up-to-date records. But this is members of the NZSG only are able to purchase this. We also have another CD, which is the cemetery records which relate only to Waikato, King Country and Taupo. This is very specialised. These records are the ones that are on the fiche, so they will be on Ancestry Online, but it was produced just for people who have an interest in the Waikato, King Country and Taupo. And then we have what we consider our gold. We've been very fortunate to be allowed by some of the funeral directors to transcribe their funeral records. I don't know if any of you have used these, but they're absolutely fabulous, because what you are getting are the family details which will appear on a death certificate. So you're going to get the name of the parents, the spouse, the date they were born, possibly where they were born. Absolutely genealogical gold. So I would suggest to you, these are available at the NZSG Library, which is the FRC that we refer to, and people say, where is the FRC? It's at 159 in Queens Road in Panmure. It's available for research by members for $5 a day, but we do allow non-members of the NZSG to come in for a charge of $20 a day. So in $20 you probably will find, if you're looking for funeral directors' records, much more than $20 worth of information. So I would suggest to you, anyone who is searching, not all funeral directors have been done, but quite a proportion, certainly of the Auckland ones, and they really are fabulous. We also, from the NZSG, have what we call our certificates collection. This is where members of the society have purchased a certificate, have photocopied it, and now make it available for us to share amongst our membership. These include not only the death records, but we've got baptisms, parish records, marriage bans, intentions to marry, wills. The list goes on and on. All sorts of pieces of paper, which are the fabulous clues that you need, and they add to the burial records. And the certificates, as you know, are expensive to purchase, but amongst our members we're prepared to share, and this is another golden genealogical clue. We also have, and I'm not sure if it's on the slides, something called our regional repositories. These booklets are available to purchase from the NZSG. I'm giving you a great sales plug today, but they have in them, for example, I just looked this morning and I had really no idea. In the Canterbury one, the Canterbury branch, it lists all the church records they're holding. And they're holding death records, Addington St Mary's, 1876 to 1948. At Akaroa, the Roman Catholic Death Register, 1892 to 1910. And it goes on and on and on for pages. That is in one branch of the NZSG. So I think you need to look, and I'll be very honest, I've been doing genealogy forever, and I had not really used this as a resource. So the regional guides, I think, are something that if you're looking for burial records, that would be well worth you looking for.
Good morning, guys. It's very nice to be here. What I'll be talking about today is what we've been working on for the last couple of years with the New Zealand Society of Genealogists. And that's the cemetery records that we have digitised together and very recently brought online. And this weekend we're actually making them all available along with all of our 35 million New Zealand records for free. So as of tomorrow, or tonight in fact, midnight tonight, all the way through to midnight on Monday, our entire New Zealand collection is open and available to search for free. So just very quickly, who am I and why am I standing in front of you? It is exactly as I said before. I've been working with Ancestry now and working with partners like the Society of Genealogists to really bring as much family history information online as possible. I really enjoy working with the various societies. I think the work that's done locally by the societies and by the volunteers within the societies is absolutely critical to family history and history overall. Without the work that the volunteers do, we simply wouldn't be able to make Ancestry as good as it is, and we simply wouldn't be able to do the history that we do. So I suppose I'd just like to reinforce something I've been saying the whole week, and that's thank you to the volunteers and thank you to the Society for making this sort of data available. We simply wouldn't be able to do it without the years and years of effort, in fact 40 years of effort, or even over 40 years of effort that has gone into this collection, the Cemetery Records collection. So what I'll do now is I'll quickly run through the collection and how it looks online, how we've actually taken the books that Gay and Di showed you just before and made it searchable, made it available to not just everyone here in New Zealand, but to everyone across the world that has an interest in New Zealand history. So the collection, it's 1.6 million records. Well, I think it's even more than that actually, and it's a collection that covers at least 1,300 sites across the country. So it covers sites from the very north all the way to the very south and east and west as well. So it's not just your urban cemeteries, it's also your smaller, much less accessible collections that are included. So what you do to actually get into the collection, of course this weekend it's much easier because everything's open and free. Even after everything goes back to normal on Monday though, we'll be charging a lot less than $1 per inspection. So getting onto the actual collection is as simple as going on to ancestry.com.au. If you are a member, signing in. If you're not, then you would register this weekend. And for the 4 days across the weekend, you have access to the entire collection. And once you've logged in, it's a simple case of clicking on search at the top of the screen, and then scrolling down and clicking on New Zealand on the country map that you see, and then that will bring up this page. It's on the screen right now, and that shows all of the data and the various collections in Ancestry for New Zealand. And you can see here actually, you're able to actually select it by region. You're able to drill in on individual collections, whether that's the electoral rolls, the births, deaths and marriages, which are an important part of our collection as well, or of course it's the cemetery records. So once you've gone on to the actual cemetery collection itself, you're actually brought to a search page, and this search page enables you to actually find the ancestor that you're looking for, the person you're interested in. So it is a very simple case of throwing in the last name, throwing in your first name, and then any other information that you may have. So you may actually know the cemetery that you think the person is actually in. You may have their birth date. You may have their death date or death year and where you think they actually passed away. So the more information you've got, the better the search results will be. However, one of the nice things about the way that the data is built, if you do just have a name, then you can still throw that in and you will get a series of results. And then you can go through manually and just check which one of those people that come back in the search actually apply to who you're looking for. So in this case, I used an example that we found on Monday at the Society of Genealogists, and I put in Alfred Alabaster. And you can see that you get a series of results, if you like, of people that could be your Alfred Henry Alabaster. In a very simple table, you then click on this view record here. If you think that this is the person that you're looking for, you click on the view record and it brings up another screen, which is, again, it's just a drill down into the detail that's available for that individual in the collection. And it shows, as you can see here, what we think that the information was that applies to that individual. So where they're actually buried, the cemetery they're buried in, who they may have been married to, which is important information, and their death date, their death age, etc. And that allows you to verify whether or not this is the individual that you're actually looking for. And if it is, of course, there's usually a bit of happy dancing. You found the person that you're looking for, and you then click on the view record, which it takes you down to the actual original document that came from the Society of Genealogists. And what that usually looks like is something like this. So it'll actually have the information about where you can find that person, in which cemetery you can find that person, who they were actually related to, the transcription from the headstone itself, and the information that's on the headstone, which again is incredibly important to your wider searches. So you might be very lucky and you might get information about who they were married to, when that spouse passed away, their children, and so on and so forth. So the records are incredibly rich and very valuable for family history. So what I'll do at the end though, because I appreciate that, I'm sure you've all got examples that you'd like to drill into yourself. We'll have a Q&A at the end and we can actually take some of your examples and do a search live if you like. But I will just very quickly give you a little bit more detail about some of the other applications that we have within the Ancestry family that are useful when it comes to looking for cemetery records and burial records. And I suppose the first thing I would say is, yes, we are a web company, but we're also a company that has applications that allow you to, on your phone or your iPad or whatever mobile device you have, that it allows you to actually stand in the cemetery and pull up the records when you're actually in front of the headstone and actually do your research when you're there. So that's what these applications, and they're both Apple as well as Android. So we have applications that are useful across all of the devices that are out there. It's those devices that enable you to do your family history when you're on the move. When you're actually in the car and you pull up at a cemetery and you think, well, maybe I should go have a look. And maybe there's someone in there that is in my family. One of the other applications that we've recently purchased and are improving significantly over the coming months is an application called Find a Grave. And what that is a crowdsourcing cemetery database, basically. And we will, at some point, be taking the data from the Society of Genealogists, the cemetery records, and putting it on Find a Grave. But you can see at the moment, there's already quite a bit of information about New Zealand on the Find a Grave website. So this is the records for Simon Streets that David was talking about before. Nowhere near complete at the moment, but it will be. But what it does allow you to do is actually go on, find a record for that cemetery at the moment, and it allows you to actually put a request in if you want a photo of the headstone. And then someone, another volunteer here in Auckland, can actually go into the cemetery and take a photo for you. And then they will share that on to Find a Grave, and you can actually see the headstone itself. Other things that you can do with Find a Grave is you can obviously find the grave itself. You can share those details onto social media. And you can also add details like where the plot actually is, so GPS or geolocation details for the plot itself. So stay tuned. It's an app that's going to get better and better and better. We're investing quite a lot of money in that over the coming years. So this is a mobile app that will make family history in your cemetery so much simpler. So before we get on to the Q&A, I thought I'd just very quickly run through how you can get updates on what we're doing on Ancestry as well, which is really important because there's always new data sets and updates to the existing data sets. And sometimes it's the updates to the existing data sets that are the most valuable. So if you go on to Ancestry, and if you click, and I will share these slides, by the way, with everyone here, but if you click on the most recently updated section via this link here, it will actually show you the collections by country that have been updated or added recently. And you can see here that we've got the cemetery collection, we've got the birth, deaths and marriages that we have recently added for New Zealand as well, which are incredibly valuable when it comes to doing research around your family history. It's nice to hear Di talking about the collections that aren't online. You should always be going back to your local society because we don't have everything. We're trying to. But it's definitely very, very, I think, useful to go back to your local library and your local society whenever you can. But this shows you what we have added recently. And you can see here at the top that we've very recently updated our Find a Grave index. So that's information from Find a Grave appearing on Ancestry. And then as the year goes on, we'll be taking Ancestry information, predominantly the cemetery records, and putting it onto Find a Grave and making the process of using that app so much simpler. Very quickly, whenever you hit a brick wall, you can either call our member services team or you can jump onto the help function that's on the website itself. And if you do have a problem, there's lots of FAQs, lots of YouTube videos that explain how you might actually overcome that brick wall or overcome that problem. So I would recommend that keep checking the collections that are updated and keep looking at help because they will help. Both of them will help you do your family history and keep you up to date on what's changed. I thought this was a good opportunity to very quickly just mention, around the updates, give you some examples of what's changed recently outside of the burial space, or outside the cemetery space, but collections that are still incredibly important to family history. And it gives you an idea of the scale of the updates that we're doing and gives you an idea of the scale of the collection, which is now internationally over 15 billion records. So here you can see very recently we did an update to the 1911 England census, and what we did was we went back and looked at the collection and made sure that it was as accurate as it possibly could be. And we updated well over 600,000 records for things like gender and where people were living at the time. So it pays to go back and check our collections because they're constantly being updated. You may be interested in this. This is another very large collection that's recently launched. Nearly 12 million records, vital records from Germany. So I know that a lot of people in Australia and New Zealand have German or at least Nordic connections. So it pays to keep up to date with what's happening in the international collection as well. And this may be of interest to you as well. This year we'll be adding a lot more passenger records for New Zealand. Last year what we did add was, in Australia, a collection of everyone from 1897 to 1963 that came into Australia via Fremantle. And very often, as I'm sure you know, the people that went through Fremantle would go on to Hobart, go on to Melbourne, and then come across to New Zealand. And there was a huge amount of traffic between the two countries. So there's a few examples of our collections that are constantly being updated. I've included some handy links at the bottom of the slide pack as well. I won't go through those now, but they'll be there on the slide pack that gets distributed. And now I'd like to do a Q&A, really, and just go back to the cemetery records, and if you've got examples, if you've got questions, then let me know. There's one now.